All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Monday, July 15th. I'm Jon Weigell here with Caya, and this is the Hustle Daily Show. The United States has an EV problem, with Tesla being the dominant EV company on American soil. The country is increasingly resistant to foreign car companies getting into the market, especially ones based in China. Shocking. Chinese EV companies have managed to create tons of revenue around the world, but are met with tariff increases and bans here in the United States. So why is that the case, and will the US ever catch up to other EV supporting countries? We'll answer those questions today with the help of Caya, who produced a video highlighting the reason that the US doesn't want Chinese EVs for the Hustle YouTube channel. But before that, let's give you the hits and headlines in business and tech. Starting us off, Google's greenhouse gas emissions were up 48% in 2023 since 2019, and in May, Microsoft's emissions were up 29% since 2020. The big problem here, you guessed it, AI. Next, the birds of New York City's beaches have been attacking the NYPD's drones, meant to search for sharks and drop flotation devices to struggling swimmers, though no humans have been saved yet, but a lot of birds have had their day. Next, the EU accused X of misleading users by letting anyone buy a blue check and thus flooding the platform with impersonators. X faces a fine of 6% of its annual global revenue if the EU's concerns aren't addressed, and 6% in this case is a lot of money. Over to dollar stores, Dollar General will pay $12 million to settle OSHA violations, including blocked emergency exits and improper merchandise storing that could have resulted in injury if items fell. General's got to tighten up his ship a little bit. And finally, a new Bankrate survey showed that 36% of American adults are cashing in on a side hustle, with the average side hustler making $891 in bonus monthly income. Not too shabby, y'all. All right, so today we're getting into the international EV market and why the US is not adopting low-cost EVs. As said before, we have Caya here, who produced a video on why that's the case. So welcome, Caya. Pleasure to have you on today.
Thanks for having me, John.
So I wanted to start off with the question here, kind of what got you on the train of thought here about the United States EV market. Obviously, it's been something at the top of everyone's mind, with Tesla always in the news and car manufacturers trying to revolutionize the way they do things. But what got you kind of on the subject?
Yeah, so the background information you guys all need is that I live, or I spend most of my time in Costa Rica, where I'd say in the past 3 or 4 years, there's been this massive influx of Chinese cars. Most of the electric vehicles that you see here are Chinese brands that we had never seen, but they've just gained a lot of popularity. And that's not something that I see when I spend time in the US. So that was kind of like the root of the question, like what's going on here? Why isn't the US adopting them?
Yeah.
I mean, they're pretty affordable. While by contrast, in Costa Rica and in most of Latin America, you can't access US EVs, i.e. Teslas and the likes.
Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting dichotomy that all of these cars occupy spaces outside the US. Like, I wasn't even familiar with many of the car brands that you mentioned in your video. But historically, it seems like the US has always kind of been resistant to the foreign cars, even going back to like European cars and Japanese cars at one point. Is what we're going through right now similar to what's happened in the past, maybe in the 80s or 90s with the US?
Yeah, that was a good story I honestly was not familiar with. I'm not a big car geek. I'm a geek, which I think that the Venn diagram of car people and tech geek people is EVs.
Oh, yeah.
It's a mix of both. Like, that's where we fit. So I didn't know the backstory of when Japanese cars first came into the US. This is post World War II. So Japan was the enemy. And suddenly, only a few years later, you have this quote unquote invasion of Chinese cars coming into the US. So there was a lot of resistance back in the 50s and 60s against Toyota and Nissan. Funny enough, Nissan had to change their name to Datsun so that people wouldn't immediately kind of connect that to Nissan, the Japanese brand. Wow. But honestly, combined a little bit with the oil crisis, combined a little bit with the quality of the dominating car brands in the US, these Japanese cars did well. And, through a couple of decades, they fought their way into the US, into the zeitgeist, and, they were adopted as American cars as well.
Yeah.
Part of that was getting them to be manufactured in the US.
Right. I mean, listen, probably the most common car, at least in New York, is a Toyota Camry. One company that you called out quite a lot in this video from these Chinese car companies was BYD, who I also never heard of before. But it seems like from what your research said is that they manufacture cars at kind of like about a third of a price of a Tesla. How exactly do they do that?
Yeah, so unbeknownst to Americans, I believe BYD surpassed as the largest EV manufacturer in the world, definitely by number of cars sold.
Yeah.
So BYD is a Chinese company that originally started as a battery company, and that's what has given them a big advantage now that they've moved into car manufacturing. So, down here in Costa Rica, BYD, you could say it's the more established Chinese car brand. And the reason why it has been able to be so successful in EVs is because they just can get away with manufacturing cars at a fraction of the price. That's a combination of their own cheap batteries that they manufacture themselves. Obviously, a lot of subsidies from the Chinese government. Obviously, a lot cheaper labor in China, but their cars are really about a third of the price of Teslas.
Yeah, pretty incredible. And you actually got to try one out yourself. How was taking it for a spin? Was it okay? Have you driven a Tesla before? And is there a comparison there?
Yeah. So I've driven a Tesla before. Ellie, who's our GP, happens to have a BYD. Wow. That was actually the first one I ever saw and I never rode on. Yeah, I think that we all understand that there's this quality sometimes to Chinese products.
Sure.
There's this stereotype around Chinese products. You wouldn't detect this in the car. Wow. Compare that even to a Tesla Model 3. I think it's a very comparable brand. But there is a stereotype, there is a stigma to Chinese cars, and people even here in Costa Rica, even though we've had them for a few years, are a little distrusting of many Chinese brands because they're brands that we've never heard of.
Yeah, and there's a ton of them entering the market at high volumes, it sounds like. So why do you think in Costa Rica, and I know you mentioned Mexico in the video as well, have kind of started to embrace these cars coming into the country more? And is there also the charging capacity to back them all up? I mean, around here in the US too, like I have trouble finding charging stations all the time.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question that requires a little bit of backstory to understand. So the story there is that cars in Latin America in general are much more expensive, not only in the actual price of the car, but by purchasing power. Costa Rica doesn't manufacture cars.
Right.
Larger countries in Latin America like Brazil, I believe Colombia has some car manufacturing. Mexico definitely does. But for the other smaller countries, there is no local car manufacturing. So cars have to be imported.
Sure.
And at least in the case of Costa Rica, the tariffs on cars are pretty high. So normal cars, like American cars or European cars, are very expensive.
Sure.
The average income in Costa Rica is, I believe, $500-$600 a month. That's the median income per person. So a car is a really, really expensive investment. And that sort of creates an even bigger breach. So yeah, people who can afford one, and yes, as a status symbol, they'll buy a European car. But the most common cars in Costa Rica for many years, and this is extended to many Latin American countries, are Japanese cars, right? So Toyota, Nissan are very, very popular brands, affordable enough, even though they are still more expensive than in the States. So what has happened with EVs, pre-Chinese cars, was, you had some Volvos, but these were some Audis, but these were $70,000, $100,000 cars.
Yeah.
We don't have a Tesla dealership, so you can't really own officially a Tesla. People import them used or new, but they're on their own. There's no warranty. There's no support. But these are early adopters that are really desperate for a Tesla. So suddenly these Chinese brands, saw this massive opportunity to bring cars that are, $20,000, $25,000, EVs that are $20,000, $25,000. It's an open field where there is no competition at that price range.
Yeah.
So the infrastructure for charging is still not great. I went to see the eclipse down in Texas and rented a Tesla. And I was a little worried because there was a chance that I had to drive out of town to find clear skies. So I'm like, can I really do that with a Tesla? Charging and everything. Not a problem. You can find buckies and just fast charge. And it's not a problem. We don't even have that here. But people that are starting to adopt EVs because electricity is very cheap are willing to go through the hoop of the difficulty of charging, but also have this massive advantage that this is a brand new electric vehicle on a $20,000 range, which is a place where not even combustion engine cars are competing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to have such an affordable option among a sea of very expensive cars that have to be imported. So you talked a lot in your video about how the US isn't embracing these Chinese manufacturers. What are they doing to prevent them from coming in? And also, what are they doing on the inside domestically to try to compete, if anything?
Yeah, so again, going back to the story of Japanese cars, right? The big concern with the invasion of Japanese cars in the 50s and 60s was, well, what's going to happen to U.S. jobs and U.S. manufacturing? The car manufacturing industry in the U.S. feeds a lot of people.
Yeah.
And that immediately becomes a political issue, that immediately becomes a divisive issue because, some of us will want cheaper cars, but people are scared for their jobs. And it's a fair argument, and there are good arguments on both sides. So I think a parallel example is Japan. So Japan's economy also depends significantly on their car industry, right? On their car manufacturing. And they are also concerned about this invasion of Chinese cars. China's a lot closer. Chinese cars are cheaper than Japanese cars in Japan, right? So it is a competition. So the way Japan approached this issue was by forming this coalition of multiple car manufacturers that sort of got together to try and collaborate and develop a car that can compete with Chinese cars. They might not be able to beat them on price, but they might beat them on quality or efficiency or some other combination of features. Mm-hmm. I think that, people in general, will prefer to buy a local car if the price difference is not that big, right? But when the price difference is double, then you really start to consider how much you want to support your own local industry, right?
Absolutely.
So that's an interesting way Japan has addressed this issue. The US, on the other hand, has sort of gone on the tariff, right? There's obviously a much larger political context to the issues between the US and China. But in the case of EVs, by the time we were starting the research on the video, tariffs on Chinese car imports were 25%, recently increased to almost 100%.
Wow.
So the US has essentially banned those. It has done that, again, because of the political environment with China. Yes, this is an election year, so it has done that to keep people who work for the car industry happy and sort of remove that concern. So it's an obvious choice. But, the question I posed in the video, and maybe I'm not the right person to answer that, but the question is, well, is that really a solution, right? It's just slapping tariffs and pretending that these cars don't exist. Is that a solution when, in the meantime, these cars are essentially dominating every other country outside of the US?
Yeah. And does that mean the US is falling deeply behind on innovation or acceptance or EV manufacturing? So it is a decision that they have made. And I totally agree with you that there are good arguments on both sides.
Yeah. And it's interesting because a lot of these brands I had never heard of. I went to a dealership for one of these brands, Cherry. I don't even know how to pronounce it. This is a brand that I had never seen before, but the dealership has been there for a few months. There are some Chinese finishes to the cars. This is fun. Like the gear sort of changed weird, like the screen and some of the stuff in the UI. It feels a little Chinese. Uh-huh. We opened the back, so the spare wheel and all of these parts are packaged in Chinese packaging, with instructions in Chinese. So they've put a layer of Western into some of these aspects, but at the core, there's still some Chinese in there. And that, again, there's a big stereotype around that, which is is this lower quality?
Right.
I think that's the ongoing concern. It was a concern that a lot of people raised in the video. I think that there is probably exaggeration and some misinformation around how good or bad these cars are. They're not catching fire. We haven't seen crazy brakes issues. Honestly, I don't think that we've even seen a recall the way some of the Tesla recalls have happened, for example, with the Cybertruck.
Yeah.
So we haven't seen stuff like that. The bigger concern is more long-term, mid-term. I think that's a concern for all EVs. How long is the battery going to last? How long is it going to hold charge? And when you have to replace it, is it going to cost as much as a brand new car? And there's a chance that that's the case. Those are still very, very valid concerns around it. But yeah, in the US, I think the fun thing is we're not even given the choice, right? It's not your choice whether you want to risk a Chinese car or not. It's no, we're just not going to have them at all. They are so risky to our industry, or they're so risky politically. And this is, by the way, one of the very few issues where, both parties, Republicans and Democrats, agree that they've agreed to ban. This is a bipartisan ban or, insane tariff on Chinese imports.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Caya. That was awesome to hear. You definitely did a lot of research for this video, so really appreciate it. And we'll definitely be keeping a keen eye on the EV industry. I know we covered that a ton on the podcast. So if you haven't got a chance, everybody go check out that video on the Hustle YouTube channel.
Please do. It was a good, fun travel video, and you get a glimpse at a couple of these cars.
For sure. All right, and that's going to do it for us today. Thanks for tuning into the Hustle Daily Show. We're a proud part of the HubSpot Podcast Network. Our editor today is Robert Hartwig, and our executive producer is Darren Clark. We've got a lot more tech and business coverage in our newsletter. If you're not subscribed, go get yourself signed up at thehustle.co/email, and we'll see you tomorrow.